you for having me. So I'm Cassandra Champion with the Texas Civil Rights Project. Our executive director, Mimi Marziani, wanted to be here, and of course she has a lot more experience in the voting rights issues than I do, but we're very glad to have been invited. I kind of come from the opposite perspective than these two tenured experts in the area. I'm fairly new, but it's been so exciting to get involved at this time and to be able to dive in head first and learn about all the barriers that are present here in Texas for voting rights. And so for the students in the audience, I would say you are also coming to it at a very exciting time. Let's see, go ahead. So we've talked a lot about the photo ID law. What I'm going to talk most about has to do with voter registration deficiencies and how the National Voter Registration Act applies. And some of the community efforts that we're involved with. Our major litigation has to do with the NVRA, National Voter Registration Act, also known as the Motor Voter Law. But we are doing some community organizing around other issues that we consider to be barriers for voting and registration in Texas, and I'll go through those kind of one by one. Good. But first, the law. So in the Voting Rights Act, passed in 1965, and was very successful in turning out more and more people to vote, increasing voter participation for about 30 years until the early 90s, and it started declining again, and people thought, or Congress thought, well, what's going on, and found that barriers in voter registration may have been one of the impediments decreasing participation at that time. So in 1993, the NVRA was passed, and it requires a few things. It requires states to establish voter registration procedures for federal elections that allow eligible voters to register when applying for a driver's license. That's what I'll talk most about. That's what our case deals with. It requires that people be able to register by mail, and that people register at public assistance and disability agencies. And it also allows for the DOJ and private citizens to have enforcement of that law. So, we go back one, I'm sorry. And so there are also local laws through the election code and the administrative code that sort of tell us how all these things are supposed to be implemented and enforced. Okay, sorry. There's also a report put out just a week or two ago from the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. If you like to follow up and research things, I thought it was really informative about the National Voter Registration Act, specifically Section 7, that says that public benefits agencies and disability agencies have to register people to vote, which was something that TCRP was going to look at closely in the near future, and the USCCR kind of beat us to it, and the chief actually, in one of his sections, the chief of the commission says, oh, Texas, 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 what are we to do with you? So check that out if you haven't. So the facts of our case, it is Stringer et al. We have 4 plaintiffs against DPS and the Secretary of State. And so our plaintiffs in this case tried to register to vote as they were renewing their driver's license information online through the DPS website. They moved, and so we're updating their information. And through the website process, they were asked toward the end, do you want to register to vote? They clicked yes, and thought they were registered. They turned up at the polls, were told they were not on the rolls, and had to fill out provisional ballots, which were then not counted. There is, to be clear, there is a disclaimer. There's some fine print that says clicking yes does not register you to vote, but this causes mass confusion. It's not just our plaintiffs. Through our investigation, we found there were over 1,800 complaints of exactly this nature, that people were confused online when they were updating their driver's license information. And the law is clear that the state must offer simultaneous voter registration with every driver's license renewal application, and that they cannot require duplicative forms. And so what these people should have done, our plaintiffs, to become registered was to click, yes, I want to register to vote, but then print out the form, fill it out, mail it in, just like you would have if you hadn't been on the website at all. And so we know that when voters go to update their information at a DPS office in person, this process is pretty seamless. There are also complaints about, your customer service representatives making mistakes, but that's not the issue in our lawsuit. in person, ideally, your information is seamlessly transmitted to DPS. And our argument is we think the exact same thing should be happening when you update your information online. We argue they have that capacity, so why aren't they doing it? I guess the best defense that they have currently is a different reading of the law. That to have you click yes, print out an application, fill it out, mail it in, is simultaneously offering you that opportunity to register to vote. So we just want them to make that change, to transmit the information. That's the remedy we want out of this lawsuit, and we think it's eminently reasonable and possible. And so the status of the lawsuit right now is that the defendants have filed a motion to dismiss our suit, and we're waiting to see what happens with that, but we expect it to go forward and that we'll be able to make this change. We're in the process of discovery and figuring out all the technical aspects of how they could transmit this information online. And our aim is to, obviously we can't make the changes in advance of the very near election this cycle, but we do expect that the lawsuit will be resolved in time to have these changes implemented for the 2018 elections. All right, what else we got? We've heard a lot about volunteer deputy registrars. One of the kind of community education and outreach efforts we're doing involves bringing to the Secretary of State's attention that some of the volunteer deputy registrar materials are not always offered equally well in Spanish as they are in English. So you have to be deputized in order to help someone fill out their registration form. If you're not deputized, all you can do is hand them a blank form, right? They mail it in. But in order to really mobilize your community and be part of the process and take that form from them and turn it in from them, make sure it gets to the right places, you have to be deputized. And if you aren't and you try to help them, there are criminal penalties. So we all take this really seriously. Now, if you're involved in voter mobilization efforts and you're a member of a Spanish-speaking community and you have yourself or the people that you are interacting with don't speak English very well, it's really important that we have people who are Spanish speakers who are able to get all of the same information as English speakers are when they become a volunteer deputy registrar. Now, we've told the Secretary of State we think that throughout the state, it's not happening this way. There are certain counties who do a terrific job. I've heard in Chaves County you can request a training in Spanish and that will be offered to you. But we've contacted other election officials in other counties who simply aren't aware that even the forms are all available in Spanish and that they should be offering the training equally in Spanish. And so we partner with other organizations which have been mentioned, the League of Women Voters, the Lawyers Committee on Civil Rights Under Law, local groups, the Texas Organizing Project, Common Cause, grassroots organizations who are out there mobilizing voters to alert the Secretary of State that this isn't happening in the way they'd like to see. And so we're sort of awaiting their response on that. What is another issue? The high school voter registration issues. We've similarly partnered with all of these community groups and let the Secretary of State know that we don't think they're meeting their obligation, which is that under the law, high schools are supposed to offer seniors the opportunity to vote, to register to vote twice a year. The Texas Civil Rights Project has been investigating this for almost a few years now, and through polls and surveys of high schools have found that only about 1/3 are really meeting this obligation. Others aren't, maybe doing it once a year. Some aren't doing it at all. Some aren't aware of the law, depending on who you talk to at the high school. And so we're working to push this initiative and make sure that all high schools are aware of it. And we want the Secretary of State to help do that. We did get a victory in that they agreed to a timeline of sequential reminders to the high school officials leading up to the voter registration deadline. So that's great. They've gotten the first one out, and we think that more people are going to be aware of their obligations. TCRP has created also, if you're not in a county where the elections officials are so proactively helping to register high school students. If you're in one that maybe didn't know about it until recently, we've created like a how-to guide, and I know Top and Common will be using something like this that shows if you're in PTA, it tells you what the obligations of your school are, what the rights of the students are. And so that's an initiative we're really excited about. Of course, all of this is that because we think racial minorities and people in poor communities are probably getting the worst end of the deal and not being offered the opportunity to register in the places that are most accessible to them. High school being so very important because you can step out of the gate after your public education and really be prepared for civic engagement. So, one other thing is not on there that I didn't mention that we're working with other groups to promote is we want to also let the Secretary of State know that there are some voter challenge initiatives that are happening throughout the state, and we want them to publicly put out information that tells people when you cross the line. If there's a public citizen who thinks that someone trying to cast a vote is not eligible, that's a serious allegation. And currently they can do that, they may be apt to do that with just a hunch or some secondary information. But we're really going to push the Secretary of State to itemize the places where they would cross federal and state law if they made those allegations. So secondhand reports, hunches, things like that should not be taken into account for challenging a voter's eligibility, violence or threats of violence, that they need to keep the standard distance away from the polling location to prohibit intimidation. So anyway, those are some things that we're doing. If you want to get involved, all of our information is up here. We rely heavily on volunteers and community advocates, so much like yourselves. So thank you.
And we'll open it up for questions.
Anybody?
Right back there.
Oh, hi.
As part of connecting with selective service, males 18 years of age still have to register for selective service. Can you link that in with voter registration?
That's a good question. It's not something that I think we've thought about yet. But yeah, I mean, part of the stance behind it, of course, is if you have to enter the selective service when you're 18, you should also be registering to vote. But yeah, that's a really good point. Thank you.
To follow up on that question, what about tying it to, say, financial aid applications?
Mm-hmm.
So as students, usually students, minority students, low income students that fill out FAFSA, and it does provide the option to automatically register for the selective service, but tying voter registration into that application might be interesting.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I haven't looked at a FAFSA in a while, but that's a great point.
Actually, on that point, just as an update, there was a bill recently that the president passed that reformed to some degree student lending, and there was an effort in the House, if I recall, to do just that, and it couldn't get the votes.
Yes.
Where do you get your money to sue the state of Texas?
Well, we are a 501c3 nonprofit. We have 5 offices in the state of Texas. We're largely funded for our voting rights project specifically. We're funded by private donations and some grants. For our other work, where we're not suing the state, we get legally type funding and TGIF funding from the state, but this is separate from that work. Also, always taking donations. Anybody else? Thank you so much.
Well, I think now you can see why we were so excited to have these people here today.